It's a pleasure to be joining you today, and I hope that you'll find this an interesting and helpful topic, especially as we are navigating these challenging times, and we are seeing a lot of mental health and well-being issues, and social media does play a role within all of that. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. I'd also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present here or listening at a later point. How much time do you spend on social media? It might be through your phone, it might be through a tablet or your computer. How often do you happen to find yourself on there scrolling through a feed? And this could be things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the list of different social media sites certainly is growing and changing all of the time. And there can be a lot of positive benefits of social media, things like staying in touch with others. And we have seen that helpful in terms of connecting with others through this time of social disconnection. As academics, it can allow you to share work, gain national, international recognition, but it can also bring a number of challenges. And some of my work, I've had the opportunity to identify both some of the things that we can learn about people through the way that they use social media, and then also thinking about some of the impacts upon mental health and well-being. And so here, I'm going to focus on a bit of that today with three particular focus. Number one, revelations. What can we learn through some of the research? What are some of the risks that you might want to be looking out for? And a few recommendations along the way. So my work in this area began as a postdoc fellow at the University of Pennsylvania in the US. And so I come from a psychology background and had the opportunity to start working with computer scientists. And we wanted to develop a method for analyzing language posted on social media, such as Facebook and Twitter. Now, this work was happening about 2011, 2012. So the big and growing social media platforms at the time were really Facebook and Twitter. And so a lot of our analyses have really focused on language and what we can learn about how people really reveal themselves online. We're increasingly seeing things like Instagram are really one of the biggest platforms, much more video and image based, which is still useful and is going to be slightly different than some of the things I'm talking about here. And so as we started looking at this, we had a data set that had about 100,000 people, and they were all Facebook users. And through the University of Cambridge, they developed a Facebook application called My Personality. And so people would go online, fill out a personality questionnaire, and optionally share their Facebook status updates for research purposes. So people are opting into being a part of this study. And so we started looking at this to say, well, what can we actually learn about people's personalities and other aspects of them through the language that they're portraying online? And I found the results fascinating as this really came together. So for instance, this is extraversion. Now, in this case, the larger the word indicates a stronger correlation with the characteristic as opposed to frequency. Frequency is based on color. So the red words are much more frequent. The gray words are less frequent with blue in the middle. And so here we see the words that are more strongly correlated with extraversion are things like party, chillin', beach, can't wait. We see multiple exclamation points, and we do see that people who are more extroverted are likely to use more exclamation points in their expressions. We see things like emoticons as well. Now, I'll note that this is a primarily US sample, and so it might not necessarily represent other cultures so well. Introversion was actually fascinating. It was all your computer science people. So much more things like anime, internet, etc. I think our bookworms we're not on Facebook and posting it in that way. This was neuroticism, which I actually found fascinating, was using words such as lonely, depression, depressed, I hate. And it's fascinating when you start to really look at how people talk online and what it can actually reveal about themselves. and how that comes out in the way that they might express themselves. Now, I will note that this was the PG-rated version of this one, and there was also a lot of bad words as well. But following up on this, we can start to say, are there things we can learn about mental health in ways that can actually help people kind of identify people who might be struggling and could benefit from additional help? One of my colleagues did some work focusing on more facets of depression. And so looking at items such as often feel blue, I'm often down in the dumps, seldom feel blue. So these are typical items that might indicate low mood. And you see the words that are associated with that. The biggest word that comes up there is alone. That when people are writing about this, it really is speaking a bit more to that perhaps low mood. In contrast, looking at low self-worth, so people who on a personality scale rate as having that lower sense of self-worth, again, you see words correlated with that. The biggest word that comes out there is why, that sense of why am I here? Why do I actually matter? And so we start to see that aspects of mental health are coming out in how people are talking about things online. Some of my colleagues did another study where they actually went into the emergency room where people are just waiting and they had plenty of time. And so they were willing to complete a short survey, and some of them were willing to share their social media updates as well. So these were real life patients recruited, and of these, about 150 had actual diagnoses of depression, and these are based on medical records. And then you had about 600 controls. And you see words that really correlate with language. And so we have things like depressed mood coming out, things like cry, tears, pain, hostility, the sense of loneliness. And so we do see these language correlates that can actually correlate with medical ratings on things. And this suggests that this can at times act as more of a screening tool. And indeed, some of the tech companies have incorporated this. You have things like Facebook Suicide Watch trying to detect people who might be struggling and could actually be benefiting from other help on things. And so we can see that the language can reveal perhaps some symptoms that a person might not necessarily report, or they might not actually be seeking help for, but could benefit from care. So we see things about personality. We also see that the language can reveal other things about people as well. In another study, we were looking at age and how does age how does language change in terms of our teenagers versus those just coming out of work versus those who are a bit older. It was fascinating working on this project because we talk about old age, which is like over 30, and I'm like, great, I'm over the hill, but and we're seeing the samples age out much more. These are word clouds that represent what people in their 20s were talking about. And so you have a focus on jobs and this need to actually be finding employment. You have apartments and houses. So it's trying to start to move out of home and establish life. There was also a social topic. So trying to maintain that social life while also becoming an adult as well. And we see other differences at different ages as well. We can also see gender-related differences. And so this is more, do you identify as more feminine or do you identify as more masculine in nature? What we see is that masculinity tends to be characterized by being more cold and aloof, whereas feminism is more warm and agreeable. And so we see this sort of warmth versus coldness in terms of how that sense of gender actually is portrayed online. You actually see a similar level of dominance. And so it's not that masculine is more dominant than the feminine, but it's a different type in terms of being warm and connecting versus more cold and aloof on things. So we can see things about, perhaps other characteristics. In some recent work, a project that just Rivet published at the end of the year, we had data from Twitter. And so what we did is we looked at personality as it's revealed in the language, and we say, well, how does it actually align with people from different professions? And so you actually see a different personality profile for different professions. Now, there's a lot of overlap there, but for instance, you see tennis professionals on the right-hand side there are almost an opposite pattern to our computer scientists. And so you're seeing how we, or sort of the personality as we see in the language, aligns with different occupations on things. Taking this a step further, we could actually cluster and identify different sort of sets of occupations based on language. Now, of course, this might not be people's real personality. This is, it's Twitter, so it might be the expressed personality. And we can't actually distinguish that of, is it the real self, or is it the, the created self? But what we do see is, whether it's the real or the created self, that we do see these patterns that occur that do distinguish in perhaps important ways. So all of this simply reflects that that people do express parts of themselves, whether it's their true or their desired self, online. If it is our desired self, because we're so socially connected, that becomes how other people actually make sense of us. And if we were to meet that person offline, we already have a sense of who that person is based on who we've come to know through what they share online. And so we can see, myself and others have talked about these as terms of digital fingerprints that we leave behind in online space. And this was focused on language, but we had these other digital fingerprints as well. How much do you like? What do you like? What does that actually reveal about you? We see that the things you like differs based on people, and it does reveal something about the person themselves. Are you more passive, or are you more active in terms of how you're online? Do you do a lot of searching? Do you have multiple social media platforms that you're always going between, or do you really stick on one? Each of these are sort of our pattern online. And so I encourage you to be thinking about, what do your digital fingerprints say about you? What do you want them to say about you? And like it or not, perhaps it's something that we do have to think about. What is that image that I'm giving out to people? And does it align with who I want to be as a person, as an academic, and in other parts of life? And so we can see that we can learn different things about people in terms of how they engage with the online space and the language that they use, oftentimes not necessarily in conscious ways, but in ways that can be important. And so beyond revelations, we also see that there are various risks of social media, especially in terms of thinking about how we feel and how we function. And so there are things that social media reveals around us. And then there's also the risks that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we really engage with the online space. We do see that social media affects people's emotions, their thoughts, so their cognitions. It impacts upon behaviors and whatnot. And we do see that the more time that people spend online, it is associated with greater risk of mental illness, lower well-being, and a growing number of problems on things. For instance, a study by Jeannie Twenge in the US, so this was a couple years ago, she looked at 2 nationally representative surveys of US adolescents. And so this was over 500,000 young people. And the study really revealed that those who spent the most time on social media, and it doesn't matter whether it's computers, smartphones, or others, were much more likely to report mental health issues. Now, interestingly enough, those who reported no time online also had some issues. So it seems like some time online can be useful, but it quickly becomes too much. And I think that's an ongoing concern that we've had in the social media space, is the challenges it can start to create around how we function and how we feel. Rosen, a scholar, talks about some of the ways that people use technology in ways that feed into this sense of lower well-being. So one, people will use it as sort of, it gives them something. So it's sort of this sense of, I get pleasure out of it. And what this can lead to is the sense of a fear of missing out. And we see this with young people a lot, is there is this real fear of missing out. And so they'll start compulsively checking online across different sites and whatnot. So there's this momentary pleasure that comes when someone likes you, or there's a good result there. But the problem is you need more and more of that for it to actually be beneficial. So it sort of becomes a short-term reward, but not that lasting element that really gives that sense of meaning and some of those deeper elements of well-being. So one is those that overuse the phone because there's this fear of missing out. There's this sense of momentary pleasure, but it becomes harder and harder to get that pleasure until it's really out of control. Another form that can lead to sort of overuse is more of a compulsive, sort of this anxiety and obsession. And so it's using social media as a way to escape feelings of worry and whatnot, but all the images and whatnot actually can feed into all of it even more. Now, it's interesting to think about some of this for those who are academics. This was an infographic that one of my colleagues recently posted. Now, this is talking about academic mental health in general. So it's pointing to some of the pressures that academics might face. And you may or may not have encountered some of these things, but things like top-down pressure, constant rejection, and very competitive landscape, imposter syndrome, something that most people in academia deal with, if not at least sometime in their life, consistently through their career. And if we start to look at social media, it actually accentuates a lot of these, and really magnifies the potential effect that it can actually have. And so if we're thinking about, I have some of these different pressures, and then this is coming into the online space, it could be setting up some of those risks. So for instance, creating a facade or fail. Just start spending time online and you'll quickly see how everyone else's life is better than yours. And we can know that they're creating a contrived image, and yet at the same time, there can often be a disconnect that, well, why do they have it better than me? If you have different colleagues that you follow, they can seem really, really productive. And so it's almost like this image that you have to keep up in order to be on the top. Think about managing rejection. You work for years on a paper. You go through multiple rejections from journals. You finally publish it, tweet it out, only to have people tear you apart because it disagrees with their perspective. And so all of a sudden you have rejection that's magnified at a very large level. Things like yesterday's news, you have to stay up to date on things, but everything is coming at a faster rate and we can psychologically adapt to it. And we are seeing a sense of overload. And so this further accentuates the pressures that arise from the online environment. And so we do see this, spending that time online, there can be benefit in some, but it can become overwhelming and actually accentuate some of the other stresses and pressures that might be there. Another risk that could be there is the whole area of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, that social media really can be a breeding ground for and is an ongoing problem. How much do you trust what you read on social media? And I think oftentimes we might be like, yeah, I take everything with a grain of salt and I don't necessarily believe it. And yet it can become very believable, especially depending on who is actually sharing things. So we're exposed to all sorts of things when we're in that online space. And there's a lot of things that, it wouldn't be on our radar otherwise. And so we have a chance to actually know about it, which can be useful, but it can be harmful. The idea with social media is, if misinformation goes out there, it's going to be self-corrected. Others are going to shoot down and say, that's not actually correct. This is the correct information. But we actually see that that self-correction in social media does not happen nearly as much as we'd like to hope. And so a lot of inaccurate or made-up news goes completely unchallenged. A report in the UK found that 42.8% of news sharers admit to sharing inaccurate or false news. And 17.3% admitted to sharing news that they thought was made up when they shared it, but they went ahead and shared it anyways. Perhaps it sounded interesting or whatever. They weren't entirely sure about it, so they shared it. But a lot of it never goes challenged. Only 33.8% of social media users reported being corrected by other social media users. So we have people posting incorrect information. They're not corrected at all. And while a discerning person might be able to distinguish things, others might not so much. And so we have sort of this misinformation that goes there. And what we see is fake news can be incredibly powerful, especially when it starts to go viral. So we look to others to say, well, is this important or is this not important? And so we're looking at how others are responding. And so when all of a sudden a story is getting hundreds and thousands of likes and shares and whatnot, then it holds that much more power, even if it's actually incorrect. Studies find that even after fake news is corrected by a credible source, people are more likely to keep believing the false news. And so as that belief is there, I show you some other news that was clearly wrong, people will hold on to that original belief. Pennycook and colleagues, they found that a single exposure increases subsequent perceptions of accuracy, both in a session, so this was in an experiment, and over the course of a week. And there's a series of different studies that suggest that when those fake news stories go out, it's hard to actually correct people's beliefs, especially if there's an element that aligns with what they want to be believing anyways. Kind of related to this are areas of misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is when things are erroneously shared. And so fake news oftentimes is we might share things thinking like, oh, this is interesting, when it's actually not correct, but then breeds that misinformation. Disinformation is purposely shared in order to actually send out that wrong information. And oftentimes it takes the forms of very legitimate looking news stories, tweets, Facebook, Instagram posts, etc. And really anyone with a computer or phone and an internet connection can potentially spread information. And this would be fine if all the information being spread was good things and reliable information. But what happens is it can be misused. You can have armies of people and also internet bots that automate the task to send out a whole bunch of information very, very quickly. And we are seeing this occurring during this time as questions around countries actually sending out disinformation. And what we see happens from that, the impact of it is there's all of these contradictory messages that are coming out. This is good for you. This is bad for you. It leads to information overload. Messages become so mixed that people stop knowing what to believe, leading to greater polarization. Example of this, we can actually see this happening somewhat in the US. There are very strong messages being conveyed on different sides, and it's very political. Thinking about wearing masks. Are they helpful? We don't need masks. We want our freedoms. And so people are frozen because they come to the conclusion that nothing can be trusted. And so this can be used in order to actually lead people to behave in certain ways. We in academia play an important role in making sense of this for people. Is when you read something, be critical of what you read. Don't just fall for something. Look at what's underneath that. What's the evidence for it? Don't believe it just because it's catching. It's also important that we do help correct things that might be incorrect. So the whole disinformation thing is something that this is a problem that a lot of the places like Facebook and Google and whatnot, they have entire teams that are trying to really deal with how you actually manage some of this because of the potential harms that it causes. So a third thing that are sort of a risk within social media that we might want to be aware of are things like Twitter wars or other online battles that can happen. And so imagine that you make a comment on something, someone else comes against it, and all of a sudden you're going back and forth and this is magnified. This can be quite dangerous. Not only is it incredibly time intensive, you can't win these battles. Journalist Nick Bilton shared about his own story of getting into a Twitter war. And he shared this in the New York Times. He notes that you can't win a Twitter war. You can't win an argument with someone on social media who is so intent on proving that you're wrong. They're not going to listen to any argument that you actually give. And by feeding that fire, it actually accentuates it even more. So he asked a different journalists whose job it is to be attacked by people online. And their advice was simply to not respond. You know, the rule about engage is that you should never actually engage. And this is that they're trying to bring you in. They're trying to argue you. They don't actually care. They're, you know, and it's actually, they're doing it just to provoke people. But what it can do is really take you down, not only psychologically in terms of your feelings, but it can actually have really a lot of problems in terms of how you're portrayed by others online. And there are different reasons why this becomes very problematic. One thing is that it's very, very immediate. So when you read something that you disagree with, our immediate reaction is emotional. We want to fight back. We want to respond to that. And social media really accentuates that. Everything is about instant response and whatnot. And so we can immediately read something, we respond to it, but the record is there, and all of a sudden it's growing from there. And so we need to slow down our response, and yet we're in a medium that encourages us to speed up even more. In addition, we lose the nonverbals. There are things like emoticons and whatnot, but people can't detect things like tone, facial expression, and sarcasm. And so we might say something that is taken out of context, and when it's already this heated environment, just blows up even more. So what can we actually do about this? Interestingly enough is some experts actually suggest that you should actually engage with them, but not there. So not in that online space, but elsewhere. It might be through email. It might be some other platform or whatever, so that this does two things. Number one is it slows down your response. Is I'm not reacting out of my emotions, but I have time to actually think through my response and make sure I do a more reasoned response. The other thing is it avoids sort of this spectacle that gets out of control very quickly. So you want to move it out of the public eye as opposed to being in that public space. Now, in the light of it is when you are being attacked, it's very hard to escape out of that. If you can have a friend that looks at some of your posts and they start to say, you know, this is getting out of control, just stop. You know, just abort and run away, because it can get ugly very quickly. So the more that you can actually avoid it and not get caught into it, it's going to be beneficial. Now, for some people, they actually try to make their career off of insulting others and doing this. Oftentimes they're very established and whatnot, and don't have other things to manage. So it's something to be very careful at. One of my own experiences with this is, and I try to stay off of a lot of any of those wars or anything like that. But a few years ago, I did an interview with a magazine, and so they published part of the interview, and I wouldn't say they actually really got things correct. And I actually read it later, and I was not really happy with some of the things that were in there. And so you could see how things could be misportrayed, as often happens when we engage in media. So then this went up on Twitter, and it started having some big critics in the field which tore it apart. which said, and so I started reading things, which really was like, wow, this is totally misinterpreted. This is not what was supposed to come out in that interview, and was, it's hard to not fight that back. But what's happening here is they're trying to draw out that response. They're trying to engage in that war. So how I actually handled it was I didn't respond on there. Instead, on my own website, I actually developed a whole blog that gave a thoughtful response. So I actually talked about the whole thing and gave credence to their side of things, as well as actually speaking to, well, here's actually the fuller truth of things. So what it did is it cooled down that response. And it actually became a really good interchange with them. So all of a sudden, instead of having this battle on Twitter, it actually becomes this other forum that actually allows others to engage with it and actually be able to read the literature in a more critical manner. Now, I'm not saying that was the perfect response to things, but there is value of thinking about, number one, don't get caught up in those Twitter wars. If you do find yourself doing that, abort, run away. And number two is, if you do engage in another forum that takes it out of the public eye and allows you to have more time to think about your response and do it in a thoughtful way. That longer response is probably the one that's going to be more lasting in terms of what people might search for and how they're going to see you as a person as a whole. Another thing that we need to, another risk of the internet is just the overload of information. And this is a challenge that we have, is that there's so much information that's coming at us all the time. How do we actually deal with all of that information and that's coming at us? And really, things are being created and developed more than we can psychologically handle it. It becomes challenging to not feel completely overwhelmed with that. A few ideas on this to be thinking about is identify your credible sources. Identify perhaps your few scholars that you go to follow information, or identify your key places for getting information. Check in with those, get your key information, and then stay off of being pulled into all of the other information that's there. You do want to make sure you don't then become too sort of tunneled in your view on things. And so we want to make sure that we're critical in what we read, but reducing that information as much as possible helps us to actually manage some of that. And then a final risk that I'll speak to is just how much time social media can start to take. And a whole part of this is that it can become just a simple distraction. And so I might be trying to work on a paper, perhaps a dissertation or whatever, and it's hard and it's challenging. And so you just go online for a moment to release some of that cognitive drain and just perhaps engage with others. Next thing you know, an hour has gone by and you don't actually know what has happened at the time. And this is a huge challenge in terms of how much we can get sucked in without actually realizing the time that's actually there. And so it becomes very important to identify ways of, number one, identifying your use patterns. How much time do you actually spend online? And are you using it in place of something else? So is an unhealthy distractor that is taking you away from the things that you should actually be doing? Another thing is that it is quite engaging and it can be really hard to actually shut that down. And so interestingly enough, we can use technology to help us. There are different apps that will actually allow you actually control how you use things. One, for instance, is Freedom 2. You install it and you can actually set up schedules of when you're allowed to engage online and when you're not. And it can be specific sites that you can only go to at a certain time, as opposed to, and so it's actually using the technology to block you from doing the things that you know might not be the best for you, but it's hard to resist that urge on things. And that one other tip on that is sometimes it could be helpful to have a certain time in the day that this is my social media time. And so you're limiting it to a certain time of the day and then not using it as an escape on things. But it's a challenge because it can pull us in so easily. So there are various risks There are others that we could talk about as well, but I see these are some that can be some traps, especially for academics and others. And so finally, what are some recommendations then? And there could be a lot of recommendations that we could be thinking about. So I'll just give a few ideas here. And it's helpful to share your ideas as well in terms of what you find helpful in terms of being a healthy social media user. So yeah, some of these that come from different studies that we've done is identifying for those who do report good well-being versus those who struggle more, what is it that they do? What is it that helps them to engage well with it in ways that it supports their well-being as opposed to detracting from their well-being? So here are a few things that perhaps can be useful. Number one is consider your content, tone, and style. One of the main things that we see distinguishes users who report high well-being versus those who report low well-being is what they write about and how they write it. We do see that people who are struggling use a lot more negative language. They reflect more on things that are going wrong. They're complaining about life and other people. They might post angry thoughts and emotions. If you write a post, before you post it, take some time and read through it. What is the tone? Are there ways that you need to actually be focusing on more positive aspects because this is actually pointing you in this more negative direction? Also thinking about, are we more of a passive or an active user? Some people post many updates, kind of showing all of their lives. Others just sort of read through things, liking things. We actually see that we don't see much difference for those who are just sort of passive users, but for those who actively use social media, so those are actually posting and things like that, people who are struggling more often post a lot more, they have this more negative content versus those who are happily engaged are really sharing some of those more positive sides. Now, the challenge here is there can still be that image management going on. But it's helpful to be thinking about what are you actually posting. Think about limiting time spent online. No studies we see really show that spending more and more time online is a good thing. And so simplify life, spend time offline, track your time, and if you're concerned about it, see if you can actually cut down. And if you find that you can't cut down, that you are missing it that much, then that might suggest that you are becoming drawn into it too much. And it becomes even more important that you actually spend some time off of it. Think about the quality as opposed to the quantity. So the quality of your use online as opposed to the quantity. Think about when you have a conversation with a friend. Sometimes you feel really good about that conversation. Other times you don't. Similarly, how we feel after we interact on social media has an indication of, is this being beneficial to me or is it not? And so if I have a good engagement on social media, perhaps connecting with some friends, I walk away and say that was time well spent, that was high quality. But if I find that I'm just clicking through things and feeling more and more impacted by it, that's perhaps higher quantity and lower quality. So be thinking about, if you're engaging in it, how can you have high quality and perhaps limit some of that quantity on things. Number 4, identify what are your motivations. Why do you use social media? People who use it to connect with friends oftentimes will feel that it contributes to well-being. So I'm using it as a way of connecting with others. In contrast, if you're using it to either fill a void, so you feel lonely and so you're going online, and so you go online to actually connect with others, and actually it makes you feel even more lonely because you see images people are posting that's not your life. Beware of social comparisons within this. Social media provides opportunities to compare ourselves with others for better or for worse. Oftentimes we might look at others and see others who are doing better than us. Or we see others, we're doing better than them. And so we're always doing this social comparison of things. And so be careful about comparing yourself to others. think about who it is you want to be online and stay true to that, regardless of what others are doing on things. In thinking about how we use it well, you might consider creating a social media policy. And so think, it's almost like, okay, this is going to be how I'm going to use social media, including when are you going to allow yourself to use it? What are the conditions of use? I'm only going to use it if I'm connecting with others, or looking at this for this reason. And if I'm doing it to fill that void, or because I'm feeling lonely, I'm not going to go on there. Perhaps what would be your reward for good use? Then we get that good or this reward for good use, as opposed to being a sort of a punishment. What are your consequences if misused? And who are you accountable for? That's a big one. We can come up with sort of this policy, but if no one is actually holding us accountable to it, then it actually becomes nothing. Create this with another. If you have a significant other, or perhaps children are a great one to create this with, is have a policy for them and they have a policy for you. Young people love to keep adults accountable on things. Really, I encourage you to take a look at yourself. Social media really is here to stay. It's such a common part of our lives, and it offers us a way to connect with others, but it can also have different risks that we do need to be careful about if it's actually going to be something that supports our well-being, as opposed to something that really detracts and hinders our well-being. So with that, thank you so much for allowing me to share some of this with you today. Happy to hear some of your questions and thoughts and whatnot.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peggy. That was really insightful and got some great ideas for how we can better use social media online in the research area of the world. We have a few questions already in the Q&A box, a couple submitted by Daniel when you were speaking. I'll read them out, even though I know people can see them, so that the recording can hear it too. So what are your thoughts on the ethical implications of Facebook's suicide risk prediction software and other such applications of natural language processing? What should and shouldn't be done with these data and findings?
So that is an absolutely excellent question. The ethics are absolutely fascinating, and they're a constantly shifting space, because ethics do have to do with what people do and do not allow, what they're actually accountable for. On the one hand, there can be benefits with things like some of the, if we can detect people who are at risk, then there's benefit to that. But then what about people, we detect someone, algorithms are far from perfect, things are being improved, but they can make things wrong. What happens if that actually sets someone up for risk? And so, what do you do with that information and whatnot? In terms of things like, having access to the data and studying it. And again, we can learn great things through things, but then have people really given permission for that? Yes, they probably agreed to all sorts of things when they click through those different boxes and whatnot. But, and we do see that social media has this sense of trust with people, is that you're holding my information. And then when we see that that is broken, and we see, especially around the psychological spaces, that when that sense of trust is broken, that's when we see the backlash on things. And so there's actually not a simple solution to it, but it's something that we actually have to work very, very carefully with our ethics review committees and researchers and others to say, well, what should we be doing? What should we not be doing? When are there actually, there are going to be benefits there, but what do we actually need to have in place to actually be protecting people well? The reality is, in some ways, we should be studying some of these things, because all sorts of companies are using all of this to sell us stuff or take us in wrong directions. And so we need to understand how that's happening. But so there's a lot of ethical issues that we constantly have to be navigating.
Fantastic. So we have one here from Kevin. He said, great talk, Penny. Thanks for sharing aspects of your personal journey. Any tips for identifying mis/disinformation online? and or what should be done to stop the spread of misinformation and fake news?
Yeah, and this is, again, a very big space that there's a lot of work going on in here, because so much of this can happen so fast that all of a sudden it explodes. So the companies are doing a lot to even try to use algorithms and whatnot to start to detect some of that, to try to take it down. I think when you do read something, and first of all, always, don't jump to, oh, that's, that must be true. Is immediately be critical of everything that you actually read. It could be completely well-founded, but start from a point of skepticism and start by being critical of things. If it is something that you find interesting, fact-check it. So go and look at, well, number one, what is the source that it's coming from? Are they actually credible or not? And a lot of the fake news stuff is often stuff that looks credible in terms of it's just a slight play off of a credible source. So it might be something, like Wall Street Journal, and it's like a slight misspelling of that or whatever. And so it looks almost credible when in reality it's actually not. So identify who is actually putting this out. And if you actually go to their website, it should have a clear about, and are they actually for a certain, are there certain things that they're actually all about that actually undermines their credibility? And then thinking about if it's actually credible, then there should be multiple sources that are actually pointing to the same thing. Could we actually identify that? And if there are alarm bells going off, if there are, especially things that start to point us to more polarization, then oftentimes there's something going on there that we need to be very careful about. Number one, believing and holding on too strongly.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question here from Daniel. How did you access and obtain the social media data sets you used in your analyses? And I believe this was the one with your word clouds.
Yeah, so that one was working with University of Cambridge. So they had actually developed the data set. And so this was something where, and these were the early days of Facebook and whatnot. And so I think it was, a lot of the data on Facebook you can't even access now because they've put so many walls around them and whatnot. So people agreed to complete the questionnaire and share that for research purposes. And they specifically agreed to share the Facebook status updates for research purposes. And so it's removing that information and then making that available. So this is a very select sample because, not everyone's on Facebook. A lot do not use this app. And I think it was about 40% of people that were actually willing to share their Facebook status updates. So, which I was surprised that it was that many, and so it was all based on permission. Now with Twitter, and a lot of researchers will use Twitter because it's publicly available. But then there are still questions about, well, how do people understand the public space? Because just because they put something out there, and we see this especially some of our younger people, they don't understand the idea of public means how public actually is and whatnot. And so we need to be thinking about how we actually protect people well in the work that we do.
Yeah, fantastic. Do we have any more questions, anyone? Either you can speak and if you raise your hand and I can allow you to talk, or any Q&A box submissions. Okay, well, if anyone has any, oh, okay, there we go. Another question from Daniel. Do you think Facebook's code should be open source?
That's a very fascinating question, and I'll leave it to people smarter than me to figure that one out. I mean, I think with all of this is the more that, in many ways, the challenge is it's a private company, and yet it's actually it's holding so much of the public space that there really is a responsibility of how to use that well. There's also the question of if it's open, who is it open to? And so on the one hand, there's the checking the things, but then what happens if the information falls into the wrong hands? That becomes a risk as well. And so it becomes complicated in terms of what the right solutions are on things. And the challenge with these companies is there's so much money involved and whatnot that you can never know what to necessarily believe in terms of what's right on things.
Absolutely. Sam here has a question. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Peggy, it's just a comment really to say, rather than a question, but to say thank you so much for that talk. I think that was really, really interesting on lots of different levels, but I personally particularly really loved your example of taking the debate offline and your own personal experience of that was really, really useful for us all, I think. We would have all taken away various aspects of this talk today, but certainly as far as hitting the brief, I think that was a fabulous talk today. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
Absolutely can second that. I'll just draw the attendees' attention to the chat box. Daniel has actually shared an article on suicide prediction, I think on Facebook, which looks very interesting. If anyone else has any last questions, please raise your hand now so that we can see it. Otherwise, we might wrap it up. This webinar has been recorded and I'll be uploading it to YouTube. But also feel free to email your questions through to Opus, or I'll share Peggy's email, if that's okay with you, Peggy. And feel free to email her yourself if you want to discuss some things some more. All right. Well, thank you very, very much, Peggy. It was fantastic having you on here.
Thank you.
And we look forward to using your fantastic tips in our use of social media.